paper and judges. Kate and I affirm, and our sole contention is bringing peace to the Middle East. Thrall of Cato in 2018 writes that prospects for snapping up market share of the global arms industry have historically powered arms sales. Unfortunately, Thrall also finds that increased arms sales increases the chance of states starting militarized conflicts and decreases cooperative foreign policy behavior. By affirming, we have the chance to reverse this trend. Ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia saves lives in 3 ways, and first is by cutting off Saudi Arabia's supply of deadly weapons. Why of the Conversation writes in 2018 that because Saudi Arabia doesn't have an arms industry, it has purchased nearly $90 billion worth of weapons from the United States. Furthermore, Caverly of the New York Times explains in 2018 that transforming the Saudi military to use the technology of other countries would cost a fortune, require years of retraining, and greatly reduce its military power for a generation to come because the military is currently set up to conform to U.S. standards. Crucially, Chatsky of the Council on Foreign Relations in 2010 explains that Saudi Arabia is completely dependent on the U.S. during the entire life cycle of every warplane sold in order to maintain and service them. In fact, Meyer of NPR writes in 2018 that if the U.S. cut off the sale of plane parts today, the Saudi Air Force would be grounded tomorrow. Second is congressional oversight. The U.S. would most likely end its arms sales through an act of Congress under the Arms Export Control Act, or AECA. Indeed, in October, Schor Politico reports that an arms sale could not pass the Senate or the House today, with lawmakers waiting for the next Trump administration-approved arms sale to reach Congress before they act. Thomas of the CRS in 2017 explains that current sales are not permissible under the AECA because Saudi Arabia consistently violates human rights. Blocking an arms deal would set a precedent to do so in the future. Indeed, the CRS explains that in 1975, congressional action over President Ford's arms sales set a precedent that Congress can regulate arms sales more generally. Notably, Kerr of the CRS writes in 2018 that Congress has never blocked an arms sale under the AECA. This is crucial because Dormini of Cato explains in 2018 that the U.S. sells more weapons to riskier nations than safe nations, unchecked by Congress. Affirming sets a precedent of blocking arms sales to nations that violate human rights, meaning that in the future, we stop arms sales to more than just Saudi Arabia. Third is using arms as a punishment to reduce conflict. Heyman of the Atlantic in 2018 explains that right now Saudi Arabia has little fear for the repercussions of their actions, emboldening them to commit human rights abuses. Thus, Caverly of the New York Times in 2018 finds that if American officials really want to encourage a change in Saudi Arabian policy, they need to take away Saudi weapons. Brinley of NBC thus concludes in 2018 that the best way to force the Saudis to change their ways is to stop sending them weapons. The impact is stopping Yemen. In total, Ensor of the Telegraph writes that 60,000 people in Yemen have been killed through military conflict. In one especially horrifying instance, Borger of The Guardian in 2018 reports that the United States supplied the bomb that Saudi Arabia used to kill 40 children on a Yemen school bus. U.S. weapons sales are also contributing to the famine in Yemen. Mundy of LSE in 2018 finds that Saudi Arabia uses airstrikes to destroy food production and distribution centers in Yemen and limit imports of food that Yemenis need. The UN in 2018 warns that as a result of these food shortages, 12 to 13 million civilians are at risk of starvation. Ceasing arms sales would prevent these strikes. To save innocent lives, vote pro.
Everyone ready? Okay. Ridge RW negates resolve. The United States shall halt all arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Contention 1 concerns geopolitics. Subpoint A is about jelly donuts. Juno 18 of MEPC finds that contrary to popular belief, U.S. power in the Middle East is actually increasing. As our allies in the region get stronger and stronger, Reuters 18 indicates that at the center of all of these alliances is the region's leader, Saudi Arabia, who acts as the linchpin for America's strategy in the Middle East. Hannigan 18 of Time magazine indicates that that the U.S.-Saudi Arabian relationship is built upon one fundamental premise. Saudi Arabia lends their support to America as long as the United States provides them with firepower and protection. If arms sales end, however, the alliance will crumble as America fails to accomplish its end of the deal. Tragically, the National Interest 18 indicates that if America loses its domination over the Middle East, the region would spiral into a free-for-all as foreign powers try and fill the power vacuum that America has left behind. Beaumont 18 of The Guardian implicates that this will amplify conflicts as nations all compete for domination of the Middle East. Subpoint B, offshore balancing. The CSIS indicates that currently the United States is utilizing the strong Saudi Arabia in order to counter Iranian influence in the region. In order to achieve this objective, Weseman 18 of SPRI explains that the United States has used arms sales to strengthen Saudi Arabia. However, if you end arms sales, the perception of Saudi Arabia as a strong ally against Iran will collapse, and America will be forced to deal with Iran on its own. This perception will ultimately be backed by reality, as Tufts University finds that due to a high dependency on the United States, the halting of all arms sales will cripple Saudi America's military for at least a decade. Tragically, the Atlantic 17 finds that if America was forced to increase aggression against Iran, it would be very easy for confrontations and small escalations to spiral out of control and lead to all-out war, which could kill millions. Indeed, U.S. News indicates that there is absolutely zero communication between Iran and America, making the chance that a small miscalculation sparking into conflict very, very probable if the United States directly intervenes. Contention 2 is weapon system stability. Subpoint A is missile development. In the status quo, Heidi 18 of the National Interest finds that Iranian missile development is posing a major threat to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, forcing them to take action. But in order to deal with Iran's missiles, the Saudis have a choice. It can either insulate themselves from Iranian missiles and keep itself safe, or it can develop missiles of its own in order to deter Iran. Luckily, Saudi Arabia has chosen the defensive rather than the offensive option, focusing on missile defense development to defend against Iran, as Goshal 18 of the Balfour Strategic Defense Center finds that Saudi Arabia has turned towards strengthening their missile defense architecture, which currently has many holes, to ensure complete protection using U.S. missile defense systems. Ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia forces them to pivot away from missile defense and towards offensive capabilities, making them fight fire with fire through their own missile program. Unfortunately, Saab 18 of Georgetown University finds that missiles are inherently destabilizing weapons because of their potential to quickly escalate conflicts, as their flight times can be very short and they are very lethal, citing that Saudi Arabian missile development will amplify conflict in the region. Subpoint B is nuclearization. Patton 18 of Newsweek indicates that Saudi Arabia is willing to build a nuclear arsenal in order to gain the ultimate edge on Iran, but Tamimi of George Washington University finds that insofar as they perceive U.S. commitment to protect them to be strong, they will never build such a weapon. However, Cavalry 18 of New York Times indicates that ending arms sales sends a strong signal to Saudi Arabia that the United States no longer supports them, forcing them to look towards a nuclear option. In fact, Sokolowski 18 of Foreign Policy finds that Saudi Arabia can enrich enough uranium to construct its first nuclear bomb within 1 year. However, rather than security, this will only bring about more chaos, as Kronig of Georgetown University finds that nuclear weapons increase instability while also making countries more confident and arrogant, increasing the chance of conflict. Moreover, Thayer 18 of Chicago finds that rapidly nuclearizing states often cut corners, making accidents and inadvertent detonations very likely. Which is why Trager 15 on net concludes that nuclear proliferation increases the chance of war by 950%. I'm good for cross.
Really quickly before cross, can I see any card that says if we end arms sales, Saudi Arabia will start building up arms? That's great. We don't have a card that directly implicates anything.
What's good on you?
Everyone good? Cool. So, at the bottom of your case, you talk about proliferation, right? You say, nuclear states increase the chance of war by, 950%. So, what is an example of where, two states with nuclear weapons, went to war directly against each other?
So we're not talking about two states with nuclear weapons going to war with each other. We're talking about when one state has a nuclear weapon and other states don't, other states around it, that is, don't. That means the chance of war in that region increases by 950%.
So, who will, if I buy this analysis, right?
Sure.
Who's attacking who?
So Saudi Arabia would be more likely to attack other countries as well.
Like
Probably
what
other
countries?
countries would be more likely to attack Saudi Arabia.
What countries?
So like we say, like specifically, it would probably look to like attacking Iran. And other
Okay,
things
but
such as
Iran
that.
also has nuclear weapons.
No, Iran doesn't have.
I mean, they
nuclear
have the
weapons.
capability. Like they have
Sure, they
nuclear
have the
reactors.
capability to build nuclear weapons, but I would argue they're
Yeah,
not going to
so
build
I would
nuclear
say
weapons.
like there's no reason why Saudi Arabia would attack Iran if they know Iran can make nuclear weapons.
Wait, that doesn't
like,
make
why
any
does this
sense. If
logically
Saudi
make
Arabia has
sense?
nuclear weapons in the first place, right? They would probably like feel free to attack Iran
So-
insofar as Iran doesn't have any nuclear weapons. In
Yeah,
status
but
quo.
they know.
But second of
So
all,
they're gonna
the
nuke
argument
Iran.
that we're going for isn't like purposeful war. The argument, as per the Thayer evidence at the bottom of the case, says that accidental detonations and launches are very, very likely.
Okay.
But even if nuclear
Okay.
war doesn't happen, the Thayer, Trager evidence at the bottom of the case says that nuclear weapons actually increase the probability of conventional war, not just nuclear war. But
Okay.
can I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Let's talk about your impact on specifically Yemen. So you tell me that there's like a massive famine in Yemen, right?
Yeah.
So what's causing this famine in Yemen?
Saudi-led airstrikes.
Oh, Saudi-led airstrikes. Why are airstrikes causing this famine?
I mean, that's the exact Monday evidence we read.
No,
at the
but like,
bottom of
what is the
case.
warranting for that?
Like Saudi Arabia bombs like food production facilities in
Okay.
Yemen.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's like what our case is.
Alright, alright.
Yeah. So then, really quickly on your case about
Sure,
like
sure.
geopolitics, right?
Uh-huh.
You say if so. Essentially, like all of your case, right?
Yep.
Is built off this premise that the United States will not be allies with Saudi Arabia, right?
The perception of that the United States is no longer.
With the perception.
Yeah.
How does that make any sense?
So like, if you're specifically talking about the first contention, right? The subpoint A says like if other countries perceive the United States no longer as strong allies with Saudi Arabia, they're more likely to rush into the Middle East.
Okay, so-
but the
so-
second, okay, sure, yeah.
So what is the like bright line for this perception, right? Because I
cutting
would
off
say
arms sales.
no. I would say
No, cutting off arms
if
sales
the
is the
U.S. always has Iran's back, or not Iran, sorry, Saudi Arabia's back. Other countries
but
know
we
if they
don't.
try to
So-
attack Saudi Arabia,
No, here's
the
thing,
U.S. will
right?
defend them.
The evidence is really explicit. If the United States cuts off arms sales, that signals to the world that the United States is no longer defending the alliance. But can I have a question?
No, wait. That signals like that we're like punishing them, right?
No,
but
it
it doesn't.
sig- it
wait,
signals-
it doesn't
like,
send a signal that
Evidence
we're
is really
never
explicit.
going to defend
Can I have a
them.
question before process?
Yeah, sure.
All right, let's talk about the second warrant on your first on your only contention, right? So you told me that there's like going to be like this congressional precedent, right?
Yeah.
So what's the time frame on us cutting off arms sales to all other nations that are like committing human rights abuses?
No, so essentially the argument, right, is
Yeah.
we cut off to Saudi Arabia.
Okay,
That's
sure.
like the biggest example of arms sales that violate human rights.
Okay,
so that
sure.
means in the future Congress
So
will
like
have the
which
power.
countries? What is the specific impact?
I mean, like there's lots of countries we sell to that violate
Okay.
human rights.
In the second national interest question, the first subpoint, in the first contention.
Oh yeah. And then any evidence that says if the U.S. like cuts off arms sales, there's gonna be like free for all.
That's the national interest.
Talking about U.S. power starting prep. Wait, is this about Syria or about like?
It's about power and influence, which is
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, that's fine. We're gonna continue to run prep starting now.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Was it that?
20 seconds.
Is everyone ready? So starting on their first contention with their first subpoint where they talk about how the U.S.-Saudi Arabia alliance, like the arms sales, are the linchpin. There's a big problem here, which is that there's a lot of other factors that underlie the U.S.-Saudi Arabian relationship. Just a couple are, first off, that the United States and Saudi Arabia have mutual protection treaties. That means they're literally bound to protect Saudi Arabia as an ally. Second off, the United States owns Saudi Arabia oil refineries and invests a ton in the nation. Third off, the U.S. leases bases in Saudi Arabia and Saudi allied territory. Fourth, the U.S. puts their naval fleet in the area. And fifth off, we conduct joint naval exercises with Saudi Arabia. That means that even if you cut these arms sales off, we're still going to have an alliance with Saudi Arabia, which means you're not leaving a power vacuum for other countries to fill. We called for their carbon. It's literally not specific to Saudi Arabia. It's talking about power vacuums in Syria. Insofar as the alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia is going to remain, you're not going to see these other countries from jousting for power. This is also second to their second subpoint, because as long as the alliance remains strong, the defense against Iran doesn't collapse. Let's go to that specifically. The internal link on their second subpoint about a balancing act is Saudi Arabia being afraid. However, in the status quo, Iran does not threaten its neighbors, even the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has dismissed an Iranian threat, stating that Iran is not a rival to Saudi Arabia. Its army is not among the top 5 armies in the Muslim world. So insofar as Saudi Arabia does not perceive a threat from Iran, that means you're not going to see this miscalculation. This is where you can turn the argument, however, because the United States selling arms to Saudi Arabia actually increases the tensions in the area. Washington Times claims that Saudi Arabia has resorted to an aggressive and interventionist foreign policy to shore up domestic support, and the reason it warmongers against Iran is in order to preserve domestic stability at the cost of regional order. What Thrall our case tells you is that the United States empowers aggressive actions by the Saudi Arabian government by giving them these military weapons, allowing them to go make these threats against other countries when they don't really have anything to back it up. The only way that you can break this cycle is by voting aft, because we decrease Saudi Arabia's capability, which is going to resolve the underlying tensions and de-escalate the region. But then within this subpoint, they say that we're going to be crippling the Saudi Arabian army for decades against Iran. But the problem here is that Saudi Arabia versus Iran specifically, their comparative strength comes from their navy. None of that material comes from the United States. And now it's going to the impact level of this contention. The impact here is tiny because Iran already sponsors Iran is not going to escalate for 2 reasons. The first off is that they don't have a capability to escalate further, and they're getting weaker right now. Khan of the FDD explains that Iranian spending is decreasing dramatically because of the snapback of U.S. sanctions. And the second is because Iran's regional influence is already at a height, especially after the 2015 nuclear deal that has allowed Iran to host foreign leaders like Putin and Macron. Basically, Sir Joel concludes that the Islamic Republic, because they already have so much soft power internationally, are never going to go and continue to start these wars, because that would undermine the soft power that they've spent so much time working to develop, which is why you're not going to be seeing any intervention between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the near future. But now it's going to their second contention. They talk about weapons, and their first subpoint when they talk about missile development specifically. The big problem here is that Saudi Arabia already has a bunch of U.S. systems for missile defense. According to the Israel Times, finds that in 2018 that Saudi Arabia secured 44 THAADs in November. That's crucial because voting for the affirmative means that you just stop future arms sales, but the arms sales that have already taken place are going to remain in the area, meaning that they have this missile defense and won't be developing these missiles. Even if you don't buy that, Bromfield Upenn in 2018 further elaborates that Saudi Arabia is going to purchase these systems from other countries such as Israel, so there's not really an impact off of this. But on the idea that they're going to build their own missile defense systems, there's 3 reasons why they can't do this. First off, defense companies can't locally source materials. Second off, Saudi Arabia's industry can't compete internationally. And third off, they have staff shortages due to poor education. Saudi Arabia can't produce their own weapons. But now let's go into their final subpoint when they talk about proliferation. The big problem here is that Lippmann explains in 2018 that Saudi Arabia will never nuclearize for 2 reasons. The first is that they rely on global markets, so they can't become an outlaw state by creating these nuclear weapons. And the second off is that Saudi Arabia knows it would cause massive instability, so on net that'd be bad for the kingdom. But on the capability level of them, Saudi Arabia just lacks the text and the expertise to make nukes. Marshall Hill in 2015 said that since Saudi Arabia has no enrichment facilities, its only possible weapons could come from a country like Pakistan, which they would never do because of international sanctions. So at the end of the day, we are weighed pretty cleanly on probability and strength of link. Voting affirmative means that you are 100% sure that Saudi Arabia's ability to airstrike is severely limited. Thus, voting affirmative means that you can be sure that the conflict will decrease to some degree, whereas the negative world requires a long chain of events with low probability to reach their nebulous impact. Thank you.
I'm going to start off by addressing the rebuttal and the responses you just heard, and then I'll move on to the case. Is everyone ready? On my first contention on geopolitics, their only response to my subpoint is that there are other factors in the alliance. I would contend that these are just added benefits to the alliance. But what Hannigan of Time magazine indicates is that the alliance is fundamentally built on one contract. America gives Saudi Arabia arms, and Saudi Arabia gives us support. If you break that contract, Saudi Arabia stops giving us support, and the alliance falls through. Then they say we're only talking about Syria. You can call the evidence. It is saying that if U.S. disengages from the Middle East, and if U.S. power in the Middle East is decreased, then we will see other countries like Russia and China try and fill the void. That's more factors in conflict. That means more conflict. With that, let's go into my subpoint point B, we got a couple responses. First, they say that insofar as there's still an alliance there, that Saudi Arabia is still going to be strong in order to counter Iran. No, because we tell you that when you end arms sales, even if there's still an alliance, the U.S. gets the perception that Saudi Arabia is now weak because they don't have U.S. arms, which leads to the U.S. trying to go into the Middle East in order to counter Iran. But then they say that Iran is really weak. But I would contend it doesn't matter what the reality on the ground is, it's about U.S. perception, and we tell you from the CSIS that the U.S. perceives Iran to be a really big threat. But then they say that arms increases aggression. A, I would contend the U.S. intervention in the Middle East is much worse. B, this is their case. I'll address it when I get to their case. But then they say that Saudi Arabia's navy is how to deter Iran. But A, the Marine Corps assessment indicates that Saudi Arabia's navy is very, very dependent on American weapons and America giving them parts in order for maintenance. So that falls through when you get rid of arms sales. And second of all, even if Saudi Arabia is still strong, U.S. perception of Saudi Arabian strength falls apart when you get rid of arms sales. But then they say that Iran is not aggressive. Even if Iran is not aggressive, America thinks they are aggressive. That is what matters. Then, on my subpoint A about missile development, they just say Saudi Arabia bought 44 SADs, so it's okay. But 44 SADs is not enough for them to complete the missile web. Because A, it is not enough to cover their entire country. But B, SAD only intercepts like mid-range missiles. It can't handle low-range missiles and high-altitude missiles. Meaning that Saudi Arabia still needs to do other things like upgrade the PAC systems there. But then they say that Saudi Arabia can get them from Israel. But Israel and Saudi Arabia really dislike each other. There's lots of historical beef there, like from the 6 Days War. But then they say that Saudi Arabia can't source the materials to build these missiles. Yeah, you can just buy them on the international market. These are pretty rich companies. And then they say that Saudi Arabia can't compete. The reason Saudi Arabia can't compete is because U.S. weapon manufacturers outcompete these companies. When you end arms sales, then there's no competition left. Now, let's go into their case. At the top of case, you read this small evidence in that arms sales increase aggression. They don't read one single warrant. I would contend the opposite is true. Because Saudi Arabia feels more secure in itself because it has lots of arms and they are less likely to attack because they have less of a need to expand their power. But then under specific warrants, first they say that they destroy the supply of weapons to Saudi Arabia. I agree that Saudi Arabia's air force and navy falls apart, but Saudi Arabia's ground army still remains because Saudi Arabia can still get basic guns and weapons from countries like Russia and China. Compatibility is not an issue there. But then they say congressional oversight. Two responses here. First, they have no example or terminal impact as to how this will affect like the world into the future. And second of all, recognize that the reason Congress will ever end arms sales is if it has an incentive to. They have to prove that Congress will want to stop these arms from going to these authoritarian regimes into the future. Also, this has no linking to Yemen, which is their impact. But then finally on this idea about punishing Saudi Arabia, what Cholet 18 of the New York Times tells you is that the opposite happens. Because Saudi Arabia does not want to be perceived as acquiescing to the U.S. and does not want to be perceived as weak and dependent on the U.S. So what ends up happening is that when the U.S. ends arms sales to Saudi Arabia, they become incentivized to become more aggressive and to increase aggressiveness and increase human rights abuses to show the world that it can defy America and that it is strong. With that, let's go into their impact about ending Yemen. The big problem here is that they are spinning a false narrative because the New York Times indicates that a specific part of Yemen where all the human rights abuses and civilian deaths are happening are the part that Houthi rebels control. And the national interest indicates that this is because the Houthis have confiscated food, they destroyed water infrastructure, and they've closed down the ports. Specifically, the national interest finds that the parts of Yemen that Saudi Arabia has liberated see less civilian deaths and quality of life go up, which is why they conclude that we need to continue to war so Saudi Arabia can win back Yemen. Specifically, we find from the national interest that the Houthis are going to be more likely to negotiate a peace deal insofar as we continue to war because Saudi Arabia puts them lots of pressure. The Independent indicates that Saudi Arabia has offered peace multiple times since 2016 and each time refused. But then they actually make the war more devastating for two reasons. The first one comes from Darwich 18 of Inseed, which tells you that Saudi Arabia needs this war to look strong. So if they don't have weapons like that, if they don't have bombs, they'll be forced to turn towards ground invasion, which is much worse. And second of all, Shalal 18 of Reuters tells you the U.S. gives them precision bombs. If you don't do that, they'll use normal bombs, which the Washington Examiner tells you blows up entire city blocks with just one strike. Good for cross?
Okay. So, the first question to you is how many SADs does Saudi Arabia need to cover the entire country?
I don't know specifically, I just know that they don't have enough insofar as they've expressed interest in buying more missile defense systems, and they have literally said they don't have enough, and Iranian missiles are right now predicted to be able to hit Saudi Arabia.
First off, we tell you the status quo, they've just wrapped up a deal for 44 of these, but more importantly, we tell you they've also just wrapped up a deal with Israel to buy their Iron Dome system. So I would say that they can get these missile defense systems from other countries.
They're still interested in buying more missile defense systems.
Sure, but if they can get it from other
countries, they want to buy more missile defense systems into the future. Also, I would contend that this is probably just a one-time deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, considering their historic rivalry.
So why is that the case? Let's say that the U.S. were to end these arms sales immediately. Why would Saudi Arabia be just like, okay, well, we're not going to go buy another Iron Dome from Israel?
Well, I mean, one, recognize that Israel has a very limited amount of Iron Dome. They have 8 that protect their country. They don't have an unlimited amount that can protect Saudi Arabia. Second of all, I'll contend this is just a one-time thing insofar as historically they've been rivals because Saudi Arabia is a very, very anti-Israel country insofar as historically they've been to war 3 times.
Sure, do you have a question for me?
Yeah, great. So let's talk about this idea about punishing Saudi Arabia. Can you name another country where the U.S. ended arms sales or punished and then they stopped doing what they were doing?
The United States Congress has never ended an arms sale to a country.
All right. So
Are you
then,
going to
what are
offer
you
my second
basing?
warrant?
Like, what is the warrant that
For
you
my sec-
punish would do? Like, this punishment reduces Saudi Arabia's incentive
Oh,
to increase.
I
the
thought you were talking about my second warrant. On our third warrant about the bargaining chip, we're just saying that right now Saudi Arabia doesn't think the U.S. Any threats the United States makes towards Saudi Arabia are credible unless we take away the
Wait,
arms
but didn't
entirely.
we end aerial refueling last month because of the Khashoggi thing? So they notice
Yeah.
the US will follow through.
That's pretty minor, however, compared to completely ending the arms deal.
I mean, it's not pretty minor. Like,
Like,
we
I
cut
mean,
down their bombing.
You
by,
give
like,
me a lot of reasons why Saudi Arabia and the United States alliance is predicated on this idea of the arms deals, right? So I would contend that Saudi Arabia
Yeah,
doesn't
so
think
if you
any
free
threat.
them from America, then they realize that
Okay,
America
well then-
no longer cares about them,
Hang on.
so they don't
So
care about America.
first off, no one in the status quo is threatening to end these arms sales to Saudi Arabia in a meaningful
What do you
way.
mean? So many articles come out saying the U.S. should
They-
end arms sales.
yeah, but
Congress
no
people
one
have said
who
that
is-
the U.S. should end
The
arms sales.
majority group in power in the government is not wanting to end these arms sales. Trump is
Well, yeah,
best friends with
obviously,
Saudi
'cause then the
Arabia.
policy would be passed already, but there's a very
Yeah,
real
so
threat.
but I'm
That's
saying
why
that
we're
if we
debating
go
it.
with the neg world and we let the neg world say the way it is, no one is really threatening Saudi Arabia to take away what they really want, which is the arms. Can I ask you a
Alright,
question?
sure.
All right, so let's say that Saudi Arabia completely beats the Houthis. What happens to Yemen the next day?
It's free and cool.
I would
Like,
con-
Saudi Arabia puts the original people who were in power before the revolt into power, and Yemen continues its
Yeah.
path of stability that it was before the rebellion.
I would contend that compared to the Houthis, which you say which are really bad for the region, I would say that comparatively, if the Houthis won the war the next day, they would be better for the region because they have a more
the New York
vested
Times
interest.
indicates that the Houthis are a radical Islamic group who praise this like mystical being and
No,
want like a
we
monarchy.
can bring up a countercard that says the reason they entered the Yemen war was because they didn't like that the government was taking away their rights in the country. That's why
Yeah,
they
because
entered the
they're
war, not for
crazy
religion.
and want to kill people. That's why their rights were
I
being
think
taken
you're
away.
really undermining an entire group of people in the country who just want
An
more
entire
freedom
group of
in
people
the
who
area.
just revolted against the government and started slaughtering
Sure, that's
civilians. I think it's pretty okay to say that they're pretty bad.
That was 113. That's 4 seconds. Alright, so it's gonna start off at the top of my case, first warrant, and then onto their case. Everyone good? Start on thorough evidence. He says that the opposite is true, and Saudi Arabia, when they have arms, doesn't want to expand. Historically, this is not true. They've expanded to Yemen, Tunisia, and Qatar. Obviously, this isn't true. That's why the thrall warranting is more legit. He says that when countries have more weapons, they want to use those weapons and they expand. Historically, you can look to Yemen, Tunisia, and Qatar as examples of how Saudi Arabia becomes more aggressive. Well, now go to our first warrant about cutting off Saudi Arabia's deadly supply. His only response is that they have a ground army and they'll use that instead. One, there's no evidence that warrants this. Two, there's no evidence that Saudi Arabia has the capabilities to pull this off. And then three, there's no reason that he gives you that Saudi Arabia is actually willing to do this. At that point, you can extend our first warrant. Essentially what Chatsky and the NPR evidence tells you is that if you affirm the very next day, Saudi Arabian planes are not able to bomb in Yemen. Why is that so critical? Because Monday of LSE tells you that Saudi Arabian airstrikes are what is causing the famine that the UN tells you directly affects 13 million people in Yemen. Thus, affirming provides a chance at getting rid of the famine and providing help to these 13 million people. But then on the bottom of our impacts, he says that the Houthis are really bad and you need Saudi Arabia to win the war. But the problem is a military defeat is no way to end a war because it just creates a cycle of violence. But then he also says that the Houthis are really bad radical Islam people who really want to kill everyone. This is kind of racist, but it's not true at all, right? In the real world, the Houthis rebelled because they were scared of getting oppressed by their government. You can call our evidence, it's pretty explicit. But then onto their case, right? At the very top, the ally evidence. What Kate tells you is there are 5 explicit reasons why the US and Saudi Arabia will still be allies. He says it's added benefits and it's only built on the arms race. The problem is this isn't true, right? We've gone through so much. Take the oil embargo of 1975, right? Essentially, Saudi Arabia embargoed oil to the United States, and we still have an alliance, right? It shows that Saudi Arabia and the United States have gone through a lot, and they're willing to go through a lot. But then, remember, their evidence is specific about Syria. You can call it and read it yourselves. But then, remember, he's on the bottom of that impact on their first contention. So he talks about the Saudi Arabian Navy needs U.S. weapons, but we're talking about U.S. Navy presence in the region, not Saudi Arabia.
All right, we'll take another cut starting. That was 1970.
Is everyone ready? Before time begins, I guess I'll start on the affirmative. So yeah, and now it's time to explain. Okay, great. Let's start off on the affirmative. The only warrant they extended is the first warrant, but they really mishandled my partner's response. They try to tell you that there's no evidence that warrants that a ground army invasion is going to occur. But what the Darwich evidence that my partner reads at the bottom of the rebuttal says that Saudi Arabia doesn't want to look weak in front of Iran, which is why they're always going to have an incentive to continue their war with Yemen. That's why they're never going to see when their air forces are grounded. What are they going to turn to? The only thing that they have left, which is their ground troops, because their soldiers still remain even after the United States halts arms sales. That's uniquely bad because my partner gives you the comparative in rebuttal. Ground invasion is uniquely worse than airstrikes because in a ground invasion, a lot more civilian lives are lost. But at that point, they also really mishandle the turn at the bottom of their impact. Specifically, this is that they're spinning a false narrative. The Houthi rebels have been committing violations after human rights abuses. The MIT finds that the only place where human rights abuses have been happening in Yemen is where the areas where the Houthis are controlling. However, on a comparative level, the national interest finds that all the areas that are liberated by Saudi Arabian forces have had a better quality of life and seen fewer civilian deaths. Insofar as that's true, the only thing that is keeping Saudi Arabia from liberating these areas and keeping Saudi Arabia fighting this war is U.S. arms. Insofar as that's true, we must negate so that we end this war. At that point, they just try to tell you that military defeat is not a good way to end the war. I would argue military defeat is a better alternative to just constant human rights abuses and letting Houthis take over the area and commit constant human rights abuses. Insofar as that's true, you're always voting neg on the AF case. But then, on the neg case, specifically on our first and second subpoints of the contention one, they really mishandle all of this. The Hennigan evidence says that the U.S.-Saudi relationship relies on U.S. military protection and in return, Saudi support. They just try to tell you the United States-Saudi Arabia relationship has been through a lot, such as the oil embargo. But recognize, the reason why we survived the oil embargo is because neither side ever cut off arms sales. Insofar as that's true, when we cut off arms sales, we cut off the foundation of our alliance. That means that Saudi Arabia, that means that other countries see that the United States is slowly pulling out, as per the Beaumont evidence, that then amplifies conflicts. But as per the evidence at the bottom of the second subpoint, that also means that the United States is more likely to directly intervene in Iran. This outweighs their entire case, because as per the Beaumont evidence, when we amplify conflicts, that makes the Yemen conflict worse. But second of all, when we cause a war between America and Iran, that involves a global superpower, which is a lot worse than just a small civil war in Yemen.
Really quickly, can I see in New York Times human rights abuses are worse than significant area? You guys ready for cross? Judge is good. So your essential response, right, is that like a defeat of the Houthi rebels is the best way to end the conflict.
I would say that defeating Houthi rebels is better than letting the Houthi rebels take over.
Okay, yeah, but
So-
like, will they ever defeat the Houthi rebels?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're
Is
already
it-
on the
are
path
they
to
tra-
defeating
No,
the Houthi
they're,
rebels.
like you've never read me any evidence
Yeah,
that
we
says
read
they're
yeah,
going
yeah,
to
we
read a
win.
rebuttal from the national interest that
An
insofar as we
extended summary.
continue
I
pressure on
extended it in
Houthi-
the summary.
insofar as we continue pressure on Houthi rebels,
Yeah.
then they'll eventually be forced into defeat. And
Okay,
we tell you that we're
that-
liberating areas right now.
That
Also,
doesn't
like, you
say
don't
anything about if we're winning the war.
It says
Like,
we're
I mean,
liberating
insofar as we're
areas right
liberating
now.
areas right
Yeah.
now. Also,
That
like,
means
you
a lot
don't
of
respond
things.
to it until now, and it's like, wait.
No, so like I did, right? The
No, you
problem
don't.
is that like having this like only saying a war can end with a total military defeat on one side is like really, really bad logic, right? Because
Why?
the problem is the Houthi rebels in the first place rebelled because of government
Also,
oppression.
That's also not like what we're
Pretty
saying.
true.
We also say that the Houthi rebels are going to be more likely to negotiate a peace deal
Yeah.
insofar as they continue pressure. That's the
That's
narrative I give you in rebuttal. That's defense you don't respond to.
I don't think he extended it. I mean, if
it's
it's a turn,
defense.
right?
No, it's defense.
No,
But-
okay.
And we
So
can
you're-
extend
you're-
the turn as defense if you want.
Irregardless, like it doesn't matter, right? Like we would just contend that like if we looked at the comparative, you would rather have a world where Houthi rebels are defeated as opposed to a world where Houthi rebels control.
my
Literally, in the
entire
comparative, a
argument-
world where the Houthi rebels have less land is still better.
My entire argument, right, is that the like you can never defeat the Houthi rebels
Okay.
because they literally
Even if we
became
can-
rebels
okay.
because of government
Here's the
oppression.
thing. Even if we can never defeat the Houthi rebels, the most critical piece of evidence that you never respond to throughout the entire round comes from the national interest. We find that like areas that are liberated by Saudi Arabia have less civilian deaths and better quality of life.
Yeah,
Even if we
wait.
can never completely defeat the Houthis, we must continue funding Saudi Arabia in their campaign to liberate these areas and decrease human rights
this,
abuses.
this
Even
is,
the Houthis
wait,
have
can I
less
respond real quick?
land,
Can I
that's
respond
still
real quick?
better.
Yeah.
This is just like obviously true, right? Areas that like Assad controls in Syria where there's no rebel fighting are obviously have better like conditions than areas where there's rebel fighting. Like this is just like true,
So
obviously.
you're saying we're true. Cool.
No, I'm saying
Yeah,
like in a civil war, you can't say like, oh, like rebels like controlled areas are so much worse. It's because in those areas the fighting is going on versus in government controlled areas there is no
like,
fighting.
Fighting's happening all over Yemen.
the-
It's about what
The
controls
reason,
what.
right? The reason why we say quality of life is worse in Houthi-controlled areas because they shut down ports, they shut down roads, and they refuse to pay
Like,
doctors
like
and
Saudi
nurses.
Arabia, when they
Yeah.
free places, they give
Like
people
here's the
food and
flaw,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like if I'm in Syria, me living like in Assad's
We're talking about
capital
Yemen.
is obviously better than me living in a rebel-controlled area because Assad has like an like
Okay, but
authoritarian
this is
regime,
not-
which means
this
it
is-
has
this
like
is not
government
Syria. This
infrastructure.
is Saudi Arabia.
It's like
and
the
Yemen.
same analogy.
Yeah, I mean,
like no,
it
it's
logically
not.
always
No,
rebel
because-
controlled like rebel
because-
fighting
okay.
areas have worse
Yeah, you're saying it's
infrastructure
because of
there's
fighting. Yeah, but in Syria it's because there's fighting going on. In Yemen, it is because the rebels are actively stealing food and shutting down
Yeah,
water.
it's
yeah.
because
There's a
they're-
very big
okay.
comparative between Saudi governance and Yemeni rebel
That's
governance.
dumb. How much prep do we have left?
36 seconds.
We'll run the rest of it.
That's time. Okay.
So there's gonna be their case, our case. Everyone ready? So one of the last contentions they go for, which is the idea of Iran. The response that they've completely dropped throughout, they've ignored throughout this round is that the America and Saudi Arabia are still going to have a vested interest in having an alliance at the end of the day, waiting for our oil to our military activities in the region. Insofar as America still is going to have somewhat of an alliance with Saudi Arabia, that means we still have a presence in the region, and we don't have a reason to go in against Iran directly. But on the impact itself, they say that the United States is going to have direct intervention against Iran. But the problem here is that we tell you that insofar as we still have our navy in the region, we still have our bases, we still have our naval exercises, that's still a sufficient perception of deterrence for the United States to not have a very high probability of going to direct war against Iran. So then let's go into the voting issues of today's round, which is ending up on our case. So what they can tell you is that if we don't, Up to this point about this, Nikhil points out in summary, is they don't have any evidence of the capability of Saudi Arabia to actually pull this off, or the manpower. That's where Chafsky and NPR evidence comes in, which tells you that if we ended arms sales to Saudi Arabia today, tomorrow their planes would not be able to take off. Monday implicates this and says the Saudi Arabian airstrikes are what's taking out the food distribution and production centers in Yemen, which the UN says is what has led to 13 million people dying, 13 million people suffering from famine. At the end of the day, this outweighs their manpower turn because of all the civilian deaths in Yemen have amounted to 60,000 people dying, whereas the famine has amounted to 13 million people starving to death. At the end of the day, if we can end the famine, we have the biggest link in saving the most people in Yemen. But then let's go into this whole turn they try to put on this case about Houthis and human rights abuses. The problem here is that what they fail to understand is that worse conditions in an area do not constitute a human rights abuse. What actually constitutes a human rights abuse is what pushed the Houthis to go to war against the government in the first place because they said that the government was oppressing them. At the end of the day, what Nikhil brings up in Grand Crossfire is he tells you that if it's in Syria, for instance, it would be better to live in an Assad-controlled area. Your situation would probably be better. That's government-controlled. But at the end of the day, you still want the rebels to win in the end because they're the ones who are actually promoting human rights and a better government. So at the end of the day, their world is just promoting cyclical war by letting the government take back over and oppress the Houthis again. Whereas in our world, we at least put an end to the famine and can at least help the people in the region. Thank you.
All right, we have a minute 20 of prep left. I'll take that starting now. I'll be very clear about where I am. Is everyone ready? It's game over for them because they never respond to the Darwich evidence, which indicates that Saudi Arabia cannot afford to lose the war in Yemen. Because the reason Saudi Arabia is in Yemen because it needs to show to the Middle East that it is strong. If it concedes in Yemen and it pulls out, it shows to the Middle East that it is weak, and Saudi Arabia cannot afford to do that, which is why we say that if you end your capacity for airstrikes, they'll turn towards a ground invasion. They just say that there's no evidence that says that Saudi Arabia will have the capability to fight a ground invasion. I would contend it's pretty logical that they can still buy guns from Russia and China, which I say in rebuttal, and it's still pretty logical that they still have the guns and ground troops they have right now. Their only evidence is only talk about airstrikes, and that's really bad for them, because we tell you that even if airstrikes are bad, when you have a ground invasion and troops coming in, that's a lot more civilians dead. But then, their entire narrative about the Houthis being the protagonists of this story is wrong, because we tell you from the New York Times evidence that all of this disease, all of this famine, these 13 million people, it is all concentrated in the area that Houthi rebels control. They just say that's because there's conflict there, and in Syria you'd still want the rebels to win. Well, in Syria the rebels are standing up for democracy, but here we see that it's the Houthis who are stealing food and shutting down the infrastructure, meaning that the best thing to do is to defeat the Houthis, which is why the national interest indicates that areas that Saudi Arabia liberates, meaning that when Saudi Arabia wins, civilian deaths go down and quality of life goes up. That is the clearest place to vote negative in today's round. But then, the second place you can vote for is our first contention. We tell you very specifically from the Hennigan evidence that the U.S.-Saudi Arabia alliance is built on a fundamental contract. America gives them arms sales and they give us support. They just say there's lots of other benefits to the alliance. I will contend that even if there's other benefits, all those benefits are built upon that contract. When you get rid of the base, the entire building collapses, which is why when you end arms sales, what ends up happening is the alliance between U.S. and Saudi Arabia collapses. This impacts the national interest, which tells you that when U.S. power in the region decreases, because Juno tells you U.S. power in the region is built on our allies, what ends up happening is that countries like Russia and China and foreign powers come into the region, and why to fill the power vacuum that the U.S. leaves behind. And Beaumont tells you that increased competition in the Middle East is what drives all conflicts. This outweighs in two ways. First, it applies to the entire Middle East rather than this one part in Yemen. But second of all, it literally includes Yemen, because when there are more factors in Yemen and more countries in Yemen, obviously deaths are going to go up, which is why I strongly urge a negative ballot for Ridge.
So, in a 2-1 decision, the con wins the round. So I guess since I'm announcing, I'll start by sort of walking through my reason for decision. So for me, this round basically came down to sort of weighing the impacts of immediately ending the war in Yemen versus through like grounding airstrikes versus like the broader impacts of potentially destabilizing the Middle East. The only offense that I sort of have coming off of the pro side of the flow that was like pulled through the round and consistently extended is that Saudi Arabia won't have the weapons to sufficiently continue to like carry out attacks in Yemen. And while I would have liked to see more evidence supporting Saudi Arabia's ground capabilities when you guys were like making that analytic about like sort of the ability of Saudi Arabia to continue the war in Yemen like with ground arms, I can also reasonably buy that Saudi Arabia could get offensive ground weapons from other countries to continue the war. I think that's like a completely reasonable analytic that I can buy. Meanwhile, on the con side of the flow, I have arguments standing about like the perception of Saudi Arabia's military strength. I can buy that like an alliance still exists where the pro sort of talks about like, oh, well, we still have all these other facets of the alliance. But if there's perception that Saudi Arabia's power is weakened, which is like talked about like in the Darwin's card, then there's potential for miscalculation and like further escalation of tensions in like the broader Middle East. And while I think that like this impact is kind of nebulous and could be better quantified, when you tell me that it outweighs like all these Yemen impacts on the pro side of the flow because destabilizing the like multiple countries in the Middle East and like the potential for like a miscalculation and the potential for like offense like between like the US and Iran is like just outweighs like things going wrong like in one particular country on magnitude. And since I didn't really get that same level of like weighing the impacts like in terms of like magnitude or on probability in the final focus, and I do get that level of like impact analysis from the con, I ended up just voting con because I believe that like on impacts con outweighs.
I also voted con, and I think what really got me was, so your national interest card, pro, in your rebuttal, you guys talked about like, this isn't specific, it's just a power vacuum, and I actually bought that, but if you would have extended that throughout your summary and your final focus, that would have done it for me, honestly. For con, I didn't really, the Hannigan evidence about like the fundamental contract, I actually like went with pro on that point. I just thought that like their logic that they already have an alliance, I just kind of went with that. But I think con really took it away when you guys talked about the narrative that pro was creating with the Houthis, and you just said that all like the famine and all that they're talking about is concentrated in the areas that the Houthis are controlling, and so they're the ones that are stealing food, etc., etc. And so I think that's what really took it away from me.
So I squirreled in this round. I guess the reason why I voted for the app was like off of this argument about like capabilities. So I guess like I didn't really know how to feel about this argument that like if you took away some of their capabilities or some of Saudi Arabia's capabilities, they would like send a full-in like ground invasion. I looked at like the Starlight card and it said that Saudi Arabia would still intervene, but I didn't really know what like intervening necessarily means. I guess like what I interpreted the app's argument to be was that like these precision airstrikes were the ways in which they were destroying the food facilities. I guess it wasn't necessarily the case that if they like sent some ground troops in, the same thing would happen. So I guess then like that was just how I interpreted it. It seemed like it was something that was unique to the weapons that they were getting. And I guess that's when like I bought the link into their impacts of like the UN card with like the 12 or 13 million lives. I just gave that to them. I don't really know how to feel about like this, like the Hannigan evidence. I had like the same opinion over there that like the alliance would still last, but I didn't really think that was too important. On to like this national interest argument, like I guess like you guys seem to suggest that like if Saudi Arabia continued, they would completely like wipe out the Houthis, I guess, of sorts, and like end the war. But like I guess like the vibe I was getting around was that like when I looked at the evidence, all they were doing was like winning a few battles. I wasn't really sure how to weigh that in the sense where it was like, oh, you win some battles and you liberate some areas, but in the affirmative world, like you end these airstrikes that are kind of like probably affecting more of the country, if that makes sense. So I guess like once I feel like they extended like there were 12 to 13 million lives, and that was like pretty clear to me. And then I didn't really know how to like weigh the Houthi part of things, so then I just voted.
We didn't make this analysis like in round, but like, would you buy an analysis that was like the reason Houthi controlled areas are worse off is because like Saudi Arabia airstrikes bomb like food production in those areas, and that's the reason why they're worse off? Like, would that analysis make sense if we?
That sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, that's. But their evidence also says like the Houthis have like pretty poor mismanagement and they're like seizing this. So like I don't think that would have taken away from what they were saying.
Right, because the evidence does also talk about like specific problems like with like the regime, like in places like where that regime's in control. So
Yeah, I think they still would have, even if you provide that analysis.
Thank you.